All right. Whoa. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session on iOS and Android apps. My name is Josh Gavant. I'm a program manager with Microsoft, working in our cross-platform tools and open tools division. I've been working on SDKs and client proxies for Office for the past year or two. Before that, I was actually a field engineer with our PFE team. So I've been somehow involved with Office and SharePoint for the better part of the decade.
Good afternoon. My name is Todd Baginski. I'm a 9-time SharePoint server MVP. I've been working with SharePoint for about 13 years now. I've had the pleasure of working with Josh for almost a year now. He builds and designs the SDKs, and I use the SDKs. So we're going to give you both sides of the perspectives of how these were built and how you can use them and build your own mobile apps. I specialize in SharePoint and Office, and about 3-4 years ago got into mobile development and have done that with all different kinds of apps on all different kinds of platforms. So that's what we're going to talk to you about. And one thing to note, our session title does not include Cordova in it, but we do have a good third of our session to show you the Cordova story here as well.
Yeah, to be fair, that's also an iOS and Android app, so it's kind of included in there. One thing that's pretty key about this session is that I'll be doing most of the demos on a Mac. We're doing a lot of the things in Xcode or Android Studio or text editors for Cordova. So we really reached out with these libraries to meet developers and meet people where they are with the tools that they use in the context that they're familiar with. So what we're going to talk about here, it's not going to be Xamarin, it's not going to be Visual Studio, it's going to be stuff that right in the places that developers work. Okay, so with that, one thing, don't forget at the end, don't forget to fill out an evaluation. Those are really helpful for us to know where we can improve and what we did well. And you can also win a prize, so don't miss out on that. What we're going to do is we'll start with talking about what exactly we provide to you to integrate your apps with the Office platform, and why you should be interested in those things, why you would want to integrate Office into your platform. Then we're going to jump in for the majority of this session. We're going to be doing a lot of hands-on demos. We're just going to be going through code, showing you how to do things, which I figure at 5 o'clock on the second day should keep you interested, I hope. So we'll go through iOS, Android, Cordova. Then Todd's actually going to show a fully featured demo app that he's built over the past 6 months or so. And then we'll wrap up by talking about some of the things you can do next if you want to further your learning. So one thing that's really key here, like Todd said, I'm the PM that's managing the development of these libraries, and some of our goals are on this slide. In fact, in that bullet point on the left, idiomatic and native libraries. We've really wanted to and tried very hard to make these libraries be what an Objective-C developer would expect, what an Android developer would expect, what a JavaScript developer would expect. Of course, they're written in Objective-C for iOS and Java for Android. But not only that, they work in Xcode. That's where we've done all our development, where we've done all our testing. Android Studio for Android, and text editors with Cordova like Atom and Sublime, or the new Visual Studio Code, or Visual. I don't want to leave Visual Studio behind for Cordova. It's actually a great place for doing Cordova apps themselves. There's also Visual Studio. We also have distributed all these things via the avenues that people are familiar with. So CocoaPods for iOS, Maven, and actually JCenter for Android and Java libraries, and NPM, which is actually enabled only since the most recent release of Cordova last week, Cordova 5.0. All of our plugins are on NPM for Cordova. And last but not least, everything is open source on GitHub. So while you don't have to go to GitHub, you certainly can. You certainly can submit issues to us there, or If you are really ambitious, submit some pull requests. We'd be happy to have contributions. We know there's always going to be stuff to work on. So that's what we provide. Now the question is, why are you interested?
So these are many of the different operations you can perform with mobile applications you create on any of the platforms we've mentioned. Opening things in OneDrive, OneNote, Outlook, sending email, interacting with the AAD graph, authentication via Azure Active Directory, and using the unified API to bring all those services together. So these are all the different, not all the different, many different ways that you can integrate your application with Office 365.
And an interesting point on this session is that what we're going to focus on is how you pick up the libraries that you need, how you start coding with them. And we're going to show some basic demos of getting a list of messages or getting a list of users, things like that. If you want to go deep and understand what all you can do with the SDKs, with the libraries, it's really about understanding the APIs. So if you either go to or watch all the sessions from all the API owners that have been the past couple of days and tomorrow, that will really give you a feel for what are all the services and data that are there. And we just tap into all that. One thing that I think is worth calling out is that really when you integrate into the Office platform, you have two options. The first is what you see on the left over here, which is running add-ins within the Office Chrome, within the Office apps. Word, what used to be Agave's add-ins, Word stuff, Excel, PowerPoint. And then the other option is integrating your own apps completely designed by you and allowing them to take services and take data from the Office platform. So really our stuff here is focusing on that element that's on the right, taking your apps and connecting into everything that Office has to offer. So there you go, plug it into email, plug it into documents, plug it into your directory, plug it into your tasks, whatever you need. So just a quick intro to how the libraries that we use are architected. First of all, we've introduced an engine, a framework, which takes the APIs, takes the metadata from the APIs, and actually creates the top layer libraries that you use. So the libraries are meant to kind of mimic the REST surface one-to-one. So whatever that, if you're familiar with OData, that dollar metadata file, the CSDL file, we take that, we put it through our generator, and we get the top level. Not only that, actually, I want to call out that that tool that we use, we've made open source on GitHub. It's called Viper, V-I-P-R. We'll have a link to it later on, or you can find it in the slides. So that's open source. If you want to use it for your own OData APIs, go for it. Underneath that, we have a shared client stack, which we use across all the libraries. So it's going to be familiar, the patterns shared across whether you're talking to Outlook or Graph or whatever. We integrate with Azure AD Authentication Library, ADAL, which makes things so much easier for authentication. And then, like we said before, first-class support for whatever IDE you are, whatever IDE is appropriate for what you're doing.
So how do you get started? Well, really, we like to boil this down to 3 steps or 3 buckets, which you can think about that you need to do in order to start from scratch and get to the point where you're calling the APIs and bringing the data back and interacting with Office 365 services. So step number 1 is basically your setup step. Here, you're going to work and set up your IDEs, and you're going to register your different dependencies that you have on the various libraries you need to do things like authenticate or to call the Office 365 APIs. After that, we're going to call step 2 authentication with Azure Active Directory, or as Josh mentioned, Live ID works as well. And here, you're basically hooking up your auth. First, get your libraries going. Second, get the authentication working. Now, step 3 comes where you can actually construct a client object and call the APIs from that client object to interact with the O365 APIs. So it's very similar to like web development, right? Make a project, add your references, get your authentication working, and then start calling APIs. Same step here, and we're going to boil these down and show you demos of step-by-step how we do this in each platform here today. Something to note about the authentication with Azure Active Directory. A gentleman in the front here has plans to integrate with SharePoint on premises. And nobody had raised their hand that they tried to do that before, so you may not be aware of how a huge step forward these APIs are for mobile developers. If you have tried to integrate with SharePoint from a mobile application on premises before, you will have discovered that if you are using forms-based authentication, it is different from how you use claims-based authentication on how you have to authenticate from the mobile app. You will also discover that if you're developing in Android versus iOS versus Cordova versus Windows Phone, all four are different code patterns on how you have to authenticate. And so if you are targeting and rolling out to an audience that is going to need to use multiple types of devices with on-premises SharePoint, that's a lot of work. And you have to know all those different patterns, and you also have to generate your own forms to just handle inputting the username and password. With these new libraries for Office 365, I think they're fantastic because I just call one line of code, and that line of code pops up my authentication form served up for me from Office 365. I enter my credentials. I click Submit. It handles all the plumbing under the hood. Next thing you know, the auth form goes away. I'm authenticated, and now I can do operations inside of my application. So as I mentioned, since many of you had not worked with that before, you may not realize those pain points and how big of a jump forward this is, but it's very substantial. The other thing to think about as you construct your client object to work with the APIs, as Josh mentioned, the generator for these APIs is looking at the metadata of the Office 365 APIs, and it's generating these SDKs accordingly. So you're essentially, Josh's tools are creating a proxy for us to really get into the APIs on Office 365. And it is going to handle passing in the OData necessary to invoke them, which makes it very easy to work with them because you're not assembling REST URLs inside of your mobile apps to hit those endpoints.
All right, so enough talk. Let's start doing some coding here. Let's show our pretty slide. So we're going to start off with iOS, and let me switch over to my desktop here. I've got iPhone 6 on the right and Nexus 6 on the left, true to actual size. So we'll start with Xcode. So what we're going to do first is we're just going to start up a new project, kind of show you how you would set your dependencies up, and then we'll switch over to something that has some code in it already. So you're set, here you come, you're going to start from scratch, create a new app that you want to work with Office 365 APIs. I open up Xcode, I click Create a new Xcode project. I go ahead and say, give me a single view application. That's the simplest one. We'll call it Build Sample. I'm going to put it into my Build Demos folder there. So those are just standard steps. I went through that pretty fast, but just create a new project in Xcode. Now, the most common way I would say for getting dependencies for iOS apps is pod files. Of those people who are developing iOS apps or looking to develop iOS apps, how many people are using CocoaPods at this point? I gotta check out. I think I saw a few hands. Yeah, cool. If you're not, then you should check it out. It really makes things easier. So one way to do that, I go ahead and right-click there. Actually, let me just show that again a little slower. I'll right-click on my project there, and I choose New File. And I go to Resource, Other, and I choose to create an empty file. Go ahead and just name it Pod File. And I get an empty file. I'm not going to type out the stuff right here. I've got it already put back here. Just copy it right out.
For
and
those
I
of you
promise
who
I'll
aren't
walk you through it.
familiar with CocoaPods, who's familiar with what a NuGet package is? I see a lot of people there. So this is the same thing essentially as a NuGet. It's just allowing you to download this assembly these libraries from the internet and plug them into your project.
Yeah, essentially what the CocoaPods project is, it's an open source project at github.com/CocoaPods, and we submit a pod spec with every release to their repo, which kind of says, hey, if you want to use the Office 365 libraries, this is where you find them, this is the Git repo to pull them from, and then downstream from us, you app developers can specify in your pod file, hey, I want to use Office 365. You write up this pod file, and once you write it up, I'll go in there in the command line and you run pod install. It talks to that repo, checks out the spec that we put up there, and pulls down the right stuff for you. And you don't ever have to go to GitHub. I like to emphasize that when I talk about these dependency managers. If you don't want to go to GitHub and you don't want to clone repos or build anything, you don't have to. Like, why should you have to do that if you're just trying to build an app? So the whole idea of this is if you don't want to look at the code, you don't have to. The first 2 lines are just kind of standard stuff that you put into any pod file to tell it where to look for specs and things like that. I have to specify the Xcode project to run against. And then the last line is the key line. You can actually specify pod Office 365, which will get you all of the current libraries. Or if you just need a subset, then I would recommend you actually say Office 365 / Outlook or Graph or Directory or whatever it is you're looking for so that the compiled binary is smaller. And then in terms of the version, our current version, we try to release a new version every Thursday. The current one we're at is 0.9.1. And we always recommend that you say equals and just take the current version and stick with that till you're ready to bump up to the next one. We try to not make breaking changes within, say, the 0.9 line till the 0.10 line. But this is still in preview, so there could still be breaking changes. So choose equals to begin with. Or if you're really adventurous, you can switch around and say :head, which will pull you the latest build that we have in our GitHub branch. So once I've specified all that, I go ahead and close that. Oops. And I will open up my command line. I go into that folder. And I just run pod install. And the astute amongst you may notice that I did not include one library, which is pretty important if I want to develop against the Office APIs. Anyone know what that is? Well, the SDK is actually specified by Office 365. That means pull down the SDKs. But I did not specify it. Does somebody? Yeah, I didn't have to specify ADOL. We did finally include that as a dependency in our pod spec. So it will automatically get the ADOL libraries, as you can see up there, to go along with the SDK. OK, so you see how all that works. Now I want to jump into an actual demo project that I already have ready to go. So far we've done the first step. Remember we said we would do IDEs and dependencies. Now we're going to do authentication and constructing that client. This is a little small here. I'll zoom in a bit.
If you notice at the bottom left on the list for the project itself, you will see the pods project has been added here. So that's what happens when you run pod install and the CocoaPods are downloaded and integrated into that particular project. A gotcha is after you run pod install, don't open the Xcode project. Open the Xcode workspace. Otherwise, the pods project won't come along for the ride. And when you try to go do things like invoke the APIs, it can't resolve them, and you'll get build errors. So that's a common mistake people make, is not opening the workspace file.
So before I actually show the code, let's actually just look at what this app looks like. Let's open up our simulator. Where is it? Maybe I need to. Did I lose it somewhere? Oh, thank you. OK, there's our simulator. And I'm just going to open up this graph demo. It's actually already loaded up and running here. And what I've done, well, I'll show you it running from scratch. We'll build it and have it start again. But essentially, this is talking to AAD Graph, pulling a list of users from our demo tenant, actually, or our test tenant, including Todd's favorite, Supersmith. He has full admin rights. And so that list is populated by AAD, or actually, this is the regular new unified API. So it's pulling all the users out of there and then just populating some basic details about them in the form underneath. So that's what we're going to show right now. So let's start by just showing authentication. We've come a long way, actually, even working within the SDK, that we've been able to kind of hide away some of the details of using a doll within the libraries. So actually, the entire process of authenticating is just these lines of code and a plist file, which contains things like your client ID and other details of your app registration. So you'll notice the main, let me just scroll a little further in. The main line here, 2 lines actually, we have a doll dependency resolver. The dependency resolver gives you the HTTP client, the JSON parser, the logger, the authentication stuff. So we have a doll dependency resolver, and we say init with plist. And actually, I'll just bring up the plist real quick. You see my plist there. It has to be called a doll settings.plist to be picked up properly, and then it's got a client ID, my redirect URI, the resource I'm going to be hitting, in this case graph.microsoft.com for the unified API, my authority, and then I just stuck in the base URLs that I'm going to be hitting too. So going back to here, again I said init with plist, picks up those values. Then the first logon has to be interactive. So I actually call dependency resolver interactive logon with callback, and I specify what I want it to do when it's done. And basically I say, if it doesn't succeed, log an error. But if it does, then go ahead and call a method, which is ultimately going to call into the APIs. And I'll show that in a minute.
A couple things to point out about the code that Josh showed so far. The first one is that he used init with plist to grab the values from the plist in order to instantiate the dependency resolver. Now, you can do that a different way as well. You can do init with context. And if you use init with context, it allows you to pass in those values that were obtained from the plist.
You actually get to create your own AD authentication context, which if you're familiar with a doll, that's like the core context for a doll.
And so by doing that, the plist one is real simple. One place to store all these strings that you need for your authentication. But if you need to go a different route and the plist is not ideal for your scenario and where you want to store these things, maybe you want to put them into the settings app in iOS so you can dig in there and change these things. We wouldn't recommend doing that for things such as the client ID, but you can also take that approach. And using that approach is very easy, actually, as you go from like development environment to QA environment to test environment, because then you can just tell your testers, hey, pop open the settings app and just put this value in there instead, and you don't have to recompile it each time.
All right, so now we've got authentication taken care of. Once that succeeds, we call update users, and let's take a look at that. This is where we make our calls into the API. Again, the point of this is to try to abstract away the rest stuff and just make it easy for you. So the main call here is we have MS Graph Client. In this case, we're working with the unified API, which in the namespaces and stuff is called Graph. There's also MS Outlook Client. There's MS SharePoint Client, which is for OneDrive for Business. There's MS Directory Client, which is for AAD Graph. And there's MS OneNote Client at this point. So we say alloc and then init with URL. In this case, I actually pulled the base URL out of my settings. And then I pass in the dependency resolver, which I created up in the previous method up at the top. So then I have my graph client. I just want to show some of the things I could do with that client here. I could say graph client, let's add the bracket, and say get. Now, whether we should be prefixing this with get is kind of a debate, but the one thing it does help with is that it instantly shows you all of the paths through the API. So I can say get users. I can then say get by ID and say get me. From there, I can say get events, for example, or I could say get calendar. and then get the events from my calendar, let's say. And then I could say read with callback. So if I was, so quickly, there was the 5 or 6 lines of code, filling in the plist, and then allocking and initting this MS Graph client, and I'm instantly calling into the APIs, and everything is taken care of for me. And I get a callback, which is a typical pattern here. I get a callback where I deal with the results. In my case, I'm not even going that far. I just call graph client get users, and there's my callback, read with callback, and I'll get back, if I succeed, an array of users, which at that point I just assign it into a local variable, a class or an instance variable, and reload my picker, which we already saw at the beginning. And that's it. That's really the main work that I'm doing in this demo, is just reading those users, populating that array, and then setting it for my picker. And then I just have a method down here that when somebody does select something from the picker, it populates those text fields.
Another thing to point out is when Josh did his authentication here at the beginning and told it to do the login, to prompt you if you're not already logged in. That's going to pick up, and the ADAL under the object under the hood is doing a lot of work for you. It's caching your access tokens, it's caching your refresh tokens, it's checking if your access token was expired. If so, it's going to use the refresh token to obtain a new access token and then put that in the cache. Previously, you had to write all that code and all that plumbing yourself to make the login experience seamless for your users. And so now, this just depends on the ADAL, and all that stuff comes along for the ride for you. Another thing to point out is when you call that interactive login, you notice there was a callback method there. You actually have to wait for that callback method to complete before you try to start calling the APIs, because if you don't, then you don't have the access token in the dependency resolver locally, and any API calls that you have will fail. So you need to pay attention to running on the UI thread as you try to do those things and waiting till your login is complete before you start calling the O365 APIs.
Yeah, good point. That's why I used interactive logon with callback. We do provide just straight up interactive logon also if you know that you don't need to, you don't have to know when that authentication is completed, like if you have a button that you'll enable when it's done or something like that. So let me just go ahead and sign on. Here you see the ADAL library at work. It pops up this dialog for me. Very little work that I had to do. I go ahead and sign in.
Better hide your screen.
Yeah, whatever. I'll change the password afterwards.
Good point.
There we go. You can see it's got results received down there, and there's my list of users again.
So if you close the app on your iPhone, in this case, and you open it up again, and your access token is still valid, you don't have to sign in again. It automatically will detect that when you run the code that we had here, and it'll just proceed forward and call your API operations.
Okay, so that's a wrap for iOS. We'll hold questions to the end because we're going to be pressed for time anyway. So let's move on now to Android. People still working on the same machines. So in Android, obviously, it's going to be Java, Android Studio, and Gradle, or Maven. Okay, so here we are. We're going to follow the same process. We're going to show you the setup with the IDEs and getting the dependencies, and then we will jump over and show you a running app, talking to OneNote, actually, this time. Just mix it up a bit. Oh, and we'll show you authentication in the interim as well. So I open up Android Studio, newly updated to 1.2 apparently today. And I will choose to start a new Android project. We'll just call it, again, build sample. We'll put it in a better directory.
Josh is doing this example for Android in Android Studio. Same process pretty much applies to Eclipse as well.
We'll target 15 and up. I choose a blank activity. We'll just go with main activity, and it puts it together for us. Yes, there it goes. One thing I want to call out while this is starting, and I'll show it to you once we get in there, is that Microsoft has been working on a plugin for Android Studio and IntelliJ, which helps with templates and starter things related to the Office 365 APIs and also some Azure services. So I actually have that installed here. I'll just show you real quick what it looks like. If I go into my directory here, I can actually say new, and then you'll see I have Microsoft activities, and I have a choice for Azure Services activity or Office 365 activity. Right now we have the October APIs are listed here, but pretty soon we'll have some of these new ones in there as well. The benefit of this is it takes one more step out of your hand. Not only do you not have to specify more than one line, you don't even have to specify one line to get your dependencies. So I just want to give a shout out about this plugin here. And you can find that by searching in the plugins directory for Office 365 or Azure. Okay, now I promised I would show how to get your dependencies. So we find our Gradle script. So the way Android Studio works, it uses Gradle underneath the hood as its build tool. And in any Gradle project, you'll have a core build.gradle file, which specifies dependencies, specifies things about your application. The part we're going to focus on right here is this bottom line, dependencies compile. This top one we don't even need. Actually, you know what? Let's copy in from my notes here and add them. Here's the list that we need.
So this is basically equivalent to what we did in the pod file. The same type of approach, different syntax, but we're doing the same thing here to register the libraries.
Yeah, if you're familiar with Maven syntax, it's the same thing. I mean, they use the same, Maven and Gradle both use the same repositories on the back end. We use for our group ID, it's com.microsoft.services. Then you say colon and your artifact ID. By the way, the various IDs and what we have available is in the README for the GitHub repo, which we'll have in one of our final slides where you can find that. So here I'm importing OneNote Services version 0.13.0, which is the version we released Thursday, a week ago. I also have to specify that I want the Android implementation of the underlying engine. And in the case of OneNote, I need live auth instead of a DAL. So if you want, once you've gone ahead and set those, you can click Sync with Gradle, that button up at the top. And what that will do is actually go ahead and download those things right now on the fly so that I get IntelliSense and everything within my application as I develop it. So let's go ahead and close this project and open up one which is ready to go. This is my OneNote sample, as the name implies.
If you're not familiar with Android Studio, we're doing this demo here on a Mac. You can also download Android Studio and run it right on your PC as well. And we do it all the time because I work on my PC more than my Mac. Josh is the opposite, but when we trade projects back and forth, I'll work on it on my PC, edit it, make changes, toss it back over the fence to Josh. He opens it right up in the Mac version, and there's no issues going back and forth from one to the other.
Yeah, that's nice. So here you see we've already imported those dependencies. Let's go ahead. Oh yeah, let's show the app at work first so you know what we're trying to do. Let me zoom out just a bit. And this one is the OneNote sample. And we get a lot of, so ignoring all that red, that's just because we're running in the emulator and it's not as fast as hardware. But you'll notice that the first thing that happens is that I get a prompt again. In this case, it's a live ID prompt. You can tell because it says Microsoft account. But again, it's mostly handled in the background for me. And I'll put in my real live ID because this password is pretty masked. And this is a really simple, so it asks me for consent. I go ahead and say yes. It's a really simple app. All it does is get a list of my OneNote notebooks. So I can just click Get Notebooks. You can see it's making a call in the background, and it's got a list of my notebooks. My wife calls herself the high-maintenance brunch girl. So I call out to her on this demo.
That's great.
Exactly. If anyone needs to know good brunch places in Chicago, that's where most of those are from. Okay, so having shown you what it's going to look like, let's take a look at the code itself. I have a lot of imports up here.
Can you make it bigger?
Oh, yeah. Yes. A lot of imports up here that, you just kind of, as you go along, you choose the ones you need. Let's see. So we start out by getting the views that we need, the list view, the button, and inflating those, storing them. We set an on-click listener for the Get Notebooks button, which we'll call this method Get Notebooks, which we'll come back to in a minute. And then we actually come back here and we call logon. Actually, this last line is something that I was just playing around with earlier, and I was going to use it to show you guys how you can dive through the API the same way as we show with a graph client. So I can say get OneNote client, and with the IntelliSense, it says get pages, get by ID. And here, actually, something that I was going to call out is that if you want operations other than create, read, update, delete, then you have to use the get operations method in between. And we have that at this point to avoid name collisions. Like if we would have just put, in this case, it's patch content for OneNote. It's one of their operations to update a page. But if there had been like an add or a create, it would have clashed with some of the defaults. So for now, at least, you have to go through get operations. But again, the idea is that it's the same pattern over and over again to try to help you not have to learn and not have to do the same thing a lot of different times. So I call logon. Let's take a look at what logon does. Actually, before we take a look at logon, let's take a look at this method here, get dependency resolver, where I actually create the liveauth dependency resolver, which I'll use to create my client. So I go ahead and if I don't have it set yet, I go ahead and create first my liveauth client, which if you're familiar with a DAL is the equivalent of the AD authentication context or authentication context. I create my liveauth client, pass in a client ID, and excuse me, didn't mean to highlight the whole thing, the client ID and the list of scopes. And then I hand off the auth client into the dependency resolver. Sorry, that's how we've set it up here. This is actually just 2 lines of code, really. These last couple things are just to turn up logging. So they're not even part of the authentication-related code. So those are the 2 things to get the dependency resolver set up. Then in the logon method, like with a DAL, like with the iOS one, I do have to call interactive initialize, which is like interactive logon, to go ahead and prompt the user to log on. Here in Android, we're using Google's Guava library for our futures. So if you're familiar with it, you can see that we call futures add callback. We specify the method that's going to return the future that we're linking to. This is how it works. There's no .then, which would be nice. Maybe somebody can write an abstraction layer above this. So I say futures add callback to this method, and then I specify the future callback. And in this case, it doesn't have much to do. It just enables that notebooks button. Basically, once the authentication is done, then I light up the notebook button so that nobody clicks it too early. Yeah, and that's the end of auth. I mean, I call interactive initialize, and once it's back, then I have the auth token. And by the way, an interesting thing about all this, both the live auth dependency resolver and the ADAL dependency resolver, is that all the token management is just hidden away. What we've done is basically when the request is crafted to send to the API, we automatically check with LiveAuth or with ADAL and say, hey, have you cached a token? If you have, give it to me. If you haven't, do whatever you need to do. Give me a token. And then those libraries figure out if they have a cache token somewhere, if they need to use a refresh token, etc. So once you set it up, you're done. You don't have to worry about it anymore. So we set the notebook button to enabled, and then remember we hooked up the get notebooks method to that button before. So let's go ahead and jump over there. So we've done now the authentication. We've set up authentication. Now we're on to the third step here for Android, which is actually creating the client and calling the APIs. So for this, let's just jump back to this method here, get OneNote client. A good practice is to have some place where you centralize the client and the dependency resolver so you don't have to create them over and over again. Just create a singleton or something for each API client that you create, which is what I'm kind of doing here, even though this is just a one-page code. So I say get OneNote client. Inside here, I say new OneNote API client. I pull out of my constants file the URL that I'm calling against, and I call dependency resolver, because that's how I'm always going to create the client with. It's going to be the URL, the base URL, and the dependency resolver. So down here, I say get OneNote client, get notebooks.read, and that's going to return a future. And I use, again, Google Guava's pattern, and I hook up a callback to it, and it's just simple, build an array of names of the notebook, and then hook that up to the list view. So nothing fancy there. And yeah, we can run it now, hopefully. Oops. Well, you've seen it already, so. But just to prove that it works.
So now we've got 2 out of the 3 platforms done, and we're going to hop over and talk about Cordova now and what that process looks like to go through the same 3 steps again.
Yeah, I think I didn't replace the, oh no, I do have my ID in there. So I'm not sure why 100% that's not working, but I don't want to harp on it right now. You saw it working a minute ago. By the way, so with that said, I want to call out that these samples, both the iOS ones and the Android ones and more, are available in the repo itself, github.com/openofficedev/ the repo name, which we'll show you in a minute, under a samples folder, in addition to a lot more samples which are available in the Office Dev org in GitHub. So all the stuff we're showing today, you can go and try out. The only thing you'll have to do is register an app ID with the DAL or with LiveAuth, and there are instructions in the README on how to do that. OK, so are we ready for Cordova? Anything else we want to say about Android?
That's all of it.
OK. So let's see. So Cordova. One of the things that we wanted to do for Cordova the past few months is we've had the ability to use the Office API tools in Visual Studio to build Cordova apps. And we still have that ability. That stuff is still there. But that was only a NuGet package. So if you wanted to use Cordova on a Mac, or you wanted to use Cordova from the command line, or a different workflow, it was a lot harder. You would have to go into the NuGet package and extract the JavaScript and all kinds of stuff like that. So what we've done the past few months, and we're at the beginning of this journey, we've moved that stuff into plugins now that are actually stored in the Cordova plugins repository at plugins.cordova.io, as well as NPM, which is where Cordova is going for their plugin management now. We also are making an effort that instead of just using JavaScript, we are migrating to let the JavaScript call into the native libraries on Android, iOS, and Windows Phone, so that we enable ourselves to take advantage of like caching and other secure things that we might be able to get from the native SDKs, which we can't necessarily get at the JavaScript layer. A place where that's particularly helpful is actually with a DAL, where we introduced about a month ago a DAL for Cordova, which wraps the DALs for Android, iOS, and Windows Phone. So,
making it very easy.
Exactly. So let's CD back out here. We're in Build Demos. So Cordova, if you haven't installed it before, you will need to install Node first. But then, once you've got Node installed, it's just npm install-g Cordova, and you'll get the Cordova client. To create a Cordova project, you just say Cordova create. I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see. We'll put it Cordova sample 3. I'm not sure what I'm up to at this point. We give it a reverse domain name ID. We'll just call it sample. And then a friendly name. And it will take care of creating the Cordova project. I see into that project, Cordova sample 3. Actually, one thing I want to show before I actually install the plugin, check this out. npm search Cordova plugin ms. I'm taking a little risk here. Come on, come on. So what this should do It does some, even if it works, it sometimes takes a second to make the call out to the npm repo. But it'll list out all of the Cordova plugins which Microsoft has registered at this point.
While we're waiting on that, one thing to point out is so this is how you can use CLI to create a Cordova project. There's another way you can do this if you're not on a Mac. You can open Visual Studio, you go File, New Project, and you look under the JavaScript section and you pick Apache Cordova project. And that creates you a Visual Studio project, sets all the files and directories up and everything, and gets you ready for basically an F5 Hello World Cordova app.
Yeah, and we'll be doing further integration of all this work with Visual Studio as we go forward. It's definitely one of our priorities. Okay, so now that I'm in here, I can just say Cordova platform, add Android and iOS. We'll just add them both. And it adds them in. And then as soon as that is done, we will install the plugin for AAD Graph.
Usually that goes like lightning.
Yeah, I'm a little surprised at that.
How many folks use CLI to build Cordova projects on Mac right now? A few people doing that, right on.
All right, let's just stop that. We do have one that's already working. Luckily. Okay, it did say it made it there. Let's just. Okay, platform Android already added. Hopefully we'll be okay. Let's see what happens. The next step would be, let me scroll this up a little. Cordova, you know what, let me just clear my screen so you can see a little better. Cordova plugin add, and what I can do is just say Cordova plugin MS AAD graph. And AAD graph, of course, has a dependency on a doll for authentication, but it knows, you'll actually notice here, it knows that there's that dependency, and it goes ahead and gets that as well. Once I'm done with that, I could just open this project in Atom or whatever your editor of choice is, and get to work. So that's a brand new fresh app. Now I'm going to go ahead and switch over to one that I already have ready to go. Let's back out of here. I think it's called Cordova Sample. Yes. And I'll again say just Atom dot. And I could do this in Visual Studio Code. I just didn't have a chance to practice with it yet, and so I'll just use Atom, which is what I've been using till now. OK, so here I am inside my Cordova app. Let's again show you what it would look like in, how about Android?
A couple things to point out about using Atom or the other text editors. It can be harder to develop in there because you don't get IntelliSense. You try matching up brackets and commas and semicolons, and they all kind of just flow together, right? We both installed the new code for Visual Studio on our Macs and took it for a spin, and we saw IntelliSense in there, right?
For some things.
Yep, for some things at this point. And you can also use Visual Studio, like I said, as well, to get your full IntelliSense as you're working through JavaScript, as well as the different libraries we're showing you here today.
Yeah, that's huge. I mean, I spent so much time just to find the brace that matches with the other brace. But I'm sure there are more expert Cordova developers than me. OK, so this is my app. I just click Authenticate there, and either it will have a cached token for me, or it should pop up my dialog for authentication.
I guess it's got the cache.
No, it should actually be doing that. It should show me if it had the cache.
That's right.
There it is. So it does have the cache, actually. So it didn't pop up the dialog here. But its log shows me that it's authenticated for me. Here's information from my ID token. And then I'm going to click List Users. And it's actually going to make a call into that same directory that I showed you before. And obviously, this is very basic. This is about the extent of my UI skills, showing all the users from my tenant. So let's quickly, as we are running down on time, let's quickly run through what this code actually looks like. It's really not that complicated. There's a couple main things to look at. So first, well, the structure of a Cordova project, if you're not familiar, the main things are in this www folder. I've got index.html, which represents the main starting page of the app. And I've got index.js, which is the main code, the logic for the app. At the very top here, I put a list of all my registration details for my client. And then let's jump in here to bind events, which is one of the first things that gets called. I have 3 buttons, of course, authenticate users and apps corresponding to those 3 options that we just saw. And I hook them up to an authenticate method, a get users method, and a get apps method. Again, so I just want to keep on that thread of setup, authentication, use the APIs. So we saw setup before when we ran Cordova plugin add. Here we're about to show authentication, and then we'll show the API client. So here's the authenticate function. Actually what I'm doing is I call authenticate internal and then pass it a callback, essentially, for when it succeeds. So the main thing for me is actually an authenticate internal. And there you'll see our old friend, authentication context. Remember, we said that Adolfo Cordova just calls down into the native libraries. So authentication context here is a wrapper around the authentication context that the native libraries have. And we can say create async. We pass in the authority. And then .then, when that's finished, we call a function with the auth context that's back. Actually, let's skip down through some of this code. There's another old friend of ours, acquire token silent, async. We try that first at Vittorio's recommendation. And then actually, if that fails, then finally we fall back to call acquire token sync. Acquire token async, but acquire token, which will prompt the user. So basically, we try to do it silently if possible, and if not possible, then we prompt the user. Then finally, if everything succeeds, we'll call the callback that we passed in. So going kind of quickly here, but the key point to take away is that when you import that Adolfo Cordova library, you get authentication context. And there's not much that you need to do with that other than create async with the authority and then acquire token with the usual parameters to acquire token to get the context all initialized and ready to go. So that's the authentication part. Then the last part, creating the API client. Here, we're going to create an AAD graph client to call into AAD graph. It's called Active Directory Client. Actually, it's called Microsoft.AADgraph.Active Directory Client. I pass in the base URL. Look at that, my authentication context that I just created, so it can use it internally to get the tokens it needs. And then resource ID, app ID, redirect URL. And then I've got my graph client. So similar pattern to what we saw before. Set up your authentication, then pass that authentication context into the client to use. Finally, later on, when I actually click that users button, I call this get users function. And the main thing is that graph client.users get users is going to get me that top level array of users. Here I use a little bit of OData syntax, and I say just get me the top 3, so it doesn't overwhelm my UI. And then I iterate through the users, and I just log out their display name, mail, and object ID, which is what we just showed.
You see there on line 97 how Josh is saying he wants the top 3 users. You can also apply additional filters at that point as well to say, OK, I want all users that have the first name Todd or something like that as well. So that can all just be chained in one line, one call to the APIs.
Yeah, all that OData stuff. If you have an IDE that provides more IntelliSense, then that would pop up more too. The good thing about this, like as opposed to writing the API calls yourself, is that user object. There's an MS Graph user or MS Active Directory client user object in there that already has the properties that you can expect to be populated by the REST calls and stuff. So it's meant to make it easier for you. Last bit to show, well, we already showed it running here in Android. Let's just show the same thing quickly in iOS. I can just go back to my command prompt here and quickly run Cordova run iOS, and it's going to build it all and drop it into my emulator.
Now, you'll notice when the iOS emulator comes up here with the app inside of it,
Simulator.
it's going to be
There it is.
branded and skinned. Oh, wait, what are we doing? We're in an iOS app. This looks like an Android app. So you can use CSS to change that when you're on iOS and make it skin it and make it look like an iOS app. One thing you'll notice that is different, when you use CLI to generate your Cordova project, is not putting any buckets for your different CSS for your different platforms into the project structure. If you use Visual Studio to generate your Cordova project, it gives you a file called merges. And each platform you add to the project will be a folder underneath the merges folder. So then in your merges folder, you can put in different JavaScript and different CSS right inside of there to target it toward different platforms.
All right, so that brings us to the end of that array of demos.
All right.
And I think Todd's got one more to show us.
Let's jump over to this one now.
Oh,
Okay,
what is-
so we've started it simple, right, and gone through the 3 steps and shown how we do all 3 platforms. So now it's time for the risky demo, the payoff at the end. So we are going to now show you like a more polished and more kind of in a line of business context application that we've created. This demo has been shown throughout the conference in many different sessions. You may have seen it already. I presented on it earlier today. This is our property inspection demo that we have, and it has mobile app components in it. I'm looking at an Office 365 web app here. It runs on ASP.NET MVC. And this is deployed, as you can see in the top here, AzureWebsites.net. I'm running this site on Azure. I am using Office 365 APIs to return these pictures from a SharePoint document library. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to hop over to the iPad here.
Which number?
Yep.
Which number is that?
I don't know which number this one is, 6, 8? You got it. It turns out it's a little bit scrunched up there. It lays out a lot better when you see it on the real iPad here, but you'll get the picture. So this is our property management application, and I am actually going to shut it down and then open it back up here on my iPad and click Sign In. I have already signed in before, and so I did it right before we started our session. And so now it is going to go out and use my refresh token to grab me a new access token. And when that completes, then it's going to come back and show me all the data. So this app that I'm running right now would be used by the person who is inspecting a property. And so they can see here are the current inspection and my upcoming inspections. And depending which property I'm looking at here, you can see the different inspections that have occurred in the past as well. So this is my sample data inspection right here. And you can see the 3 pictures I've got in there. So I actually uploaded the first picture in the list, and I took the last 2 pictures. Let's go for the hat trick, see if we can get it to go 3 times in a row here. It's a little bit dicey sometimes at a conference with the connectivity to get it to work. But essentially what I'm going to do is tap on the Incidents tab, pick my camera, and say New Photo. And I am going to take a picture of the audience here.
Or a lot of bright lights.
There we go, yep. Oh, the cord fell out. It should come back here in a second. There we go. Okay, so you can see my picture at the top there. And what kind of issue do we have for this incident? It looks like electrical. We've got way too much brightness going on here. So I'm going to hit Done and submit that information to SharePoint. It says it updated the incident item, so it wrote a list item to SharePoint to say there is an incident that occurred, and it uploaded the image. So now I'm going to come back we flip back to this one, to my Office 365 app. And I'm going to refresh this page here. And this page refresh has been taking about 25 seconds since I've been up here on the podium, but it has been coming back. And we can see we've got 3 pictures. Boom, there's the 4th picture I just took. So as you can see, you can do some pretty clever integrations in order to push data and media into Office 365.
Should we
Swap
do that
over to
fast,
this
or?
one. Yeah, okay, yeah, we'll skip showing the code. So the code that
Let's
did
talk
that
about it.
exact operation right there is on github.com/officedev. And in that, section, look for the property inspection code sample. And we have actually built that same app in iOS, Android, Cordova, and Xamarin. It's the exact same thing. It's just skinned different to look different for each type of device.
One thing that's pretty cool about Todd's app is that while we focused on the modern APIs that are that use the compartmentalized metadata files, Todd's stuff works with lists, which actually we do have SDKs in the libraries that work with lists also, but they are not auto-generated, and we have to maintain them manually. So Todd actually started with what we had, built on it, and expanded it to do some of the stuff he did. So if you do need the list client, it's in there, and we'd be happy to partner further to continue developing that.
And that's the beauty of the fact that these are all open source. You can just pick up what's there and go, oh, well, it's most of the way there on what I need to do for this operation, and then just write a couple lines of code to enhance it to do what you want.
Cool. So that is about all for now. We have up here a list of resources. dev.office.com is your first stop for information. Go to /Android or /iOS for those respective platforms. In GitHub, go to the Office Dev org. That's just the easy one to remember. Under there, you'll find Office 365 SDK for iOS. For Android, you'll find Office O365 Android snippets and Connect, which are a couple samples. Azure AD is where you'll find the ADAL and AAD Graph plugins. MS OpenTech has a lot of some of the core work that's been done here as well, Viper, for example. We do have 3 more slides here, which we're not going to go through now, but if you get the deck here, you can just get these slides, which have the exact names of the repos that you might want to hit: iOS, Android, and Cordova. Finally, we want to call out, if you've been to the other Office sessions, this has been brought up, but we're launching the developer program, which can really help you get started developing in all kinds of ways against the Office APIs and to plug in and to add into the Office apps. So check out dev.office.com/dev program. And finally, sign up for the developer program, check out the Express Talks downstairs, get stickers and get prizes, and enjoy your time at Build. And please don't forget, if you can, give us an evaluation, what you think we can improve on for next time, what you think we did well. That's really good stuff for us, and you could get a prize for it. So thanks a lot. Appreciate your time.